Doctor and all of my fellow friends. My name is Ellen, and I'm going to talk about the early education during the British period. Prior to British colonization, education was informal and limited to acquiring skills vital for survival, which means fishing and farming for boys, meanwhile cooking and weaving for girls. More advanced type of education during that period came in the form of the pondok or hut schools, and education there was based on Islamic studies. The student here, they studied Quran under Haji or Khatib that were set up by the scholar or even at their home, surau or mosque. And the last one, Christian missionary school, which were established during the Portuguese and Dutch occupation. In this type of education, they didn't have much response from the Malay community, because the Malay community afraid that their children will influenced by the Christianity.
Assalamualaikum, hi and very good afternoon to Dr. and my fellow friends. I am Nur Isbahani binti Ahmad Nazri. I'm going to present about the British policy on education. So during the British occupation of Malaya, there was no clear policy on education. The British were contented to let the various types of schools which were already in existence carry on with their own activities. In following through with their divide and rule policy, the British didn't intend to establish rapat between different races in Malaya through a standardized education systems. Hence, the various vernacular schools that were present and catered to only a particular ethnic group were run by either missionaries, rubber and coffee plantation owners, also a local residents association. The British felt that it was enough for each ethnic group to be educated in their own language and learn to accept their roles in life. That means that the British were to govern the Malays to cultivate the fields, and the Chinese were to run the mining industry and businesses, while the Indians will be confined to plantations and estates. This has contributed much to preserving the status quo of the different races in Malaya and identifying them with their various economic activities. The British private sector was given free rein to operate and maximize profits. They protected and promoted the interests of community companies by providing a supportive legislative. Other forms of government support include the provision of choice land for plantation with minimal restrictions and at nominal prices, low export duties and taxes, and the subsidization of the immigration of low-cost labor from India. By the eve of World War I, the UK presided over the world's preeminent colonial empire, owning foreign assets equivalent to nearly 2 years of its own national income. By the turn of the 20th century, capital invested abroad was yielding around 5% a year in dividends, so the UK national income was around 10% higher than domestic product. One consequence of such laissez-faire practice was uneven development, with economic growth being concentrated in areas of the west coast states of the peninsula where tin mines and rubber plantations were located. These states also developed better infrastructure. In the east coast states, the population was mainly engaged in low productivity subsistence, agriculture and fishing, which later or no development. Another consequence was the sharp inequality that developed in relation to ownership and control the economy. Income inequality widened for two reasons. First, the rising income and profits from the capital went and richer people. Second, the wages were largely stagnant, so the gap rich and provident. Real wages were more or less stagnant between 19,000 until 1939, growing on an average at only 1.6% per annum. Investment growth rates in real terms, averaging less than 10% per annum, were also very low, as was the government expenditure, suggesting that the little of the production surplus was being reinvested in the domestic economy. It was clear that the colonial government had no strategic vision for the economic transformation or for the social development of the local population. As in India, colonial rule in Malaya was just based on the principle of maximizing profits from rubber and tin industry to better cater to British business. That's all from me.
Hi, my name is Aisha Nadira binti Abdul Muttalib. I'm going to talk about Malay vernacular schools. Until 1858, Malay vernacular schools received support from the East India Company. It was only the year that followed this that Malay vernacular schools came to be monitored by the government. In Malay vernacular schools, the curriculum was rather elementary to meet the needs of the kampung folk. Students were taught the basic of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In addition to this, other academic subjects such as geography and Malay history were taught. Since such schools were set up particularly to ensure that younger generation were able to provide for themselves and their future generation, living skills were definitely a must and included basket making and other handicrafts, vegetables gardening, poultry, farming, and more. Despite the fact that education was free at that time, Malay vernacular schools only gather little response from the Malay society. The benefits of such education seemed trivial to the Malays then, and skills such as reading, writing, and arithmetic were of a little use of the village folk. Children were also expected to help in carrying out duties at home or in fields, and this very much contributed to the low attendance rate in schools. Due to this, the British government felt compelled to implement compulsory education in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Malay chiefs were commissioned to encourage parents to send their children to school. Due to these efforts by British, the numbers of students in Malay vernacular schools increased to 8,000 in 1909. Numbers of Malay schools in 1916. The strait settlements in Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, numbers of schools are 191. The total enrollment is 12,934. The attendance were 11,034. For the federated Malay states, Selangor, Perak, Negeri Sembilan, and Pahang, number of schools are 365. Numbers of enrollments are 18,034. Total attendance are 14,535. For the unfederated Malay states, Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Perlis, and Terengganu, number of schools 137. Total enrollment is less than 7,923. Total attendance is less than 6,940. Despite the increase in the number of Malay vernacular schools in the Peninsular Malaysia, it should be noted, however, that such schools were still scarce in the unfederated Malay states. This was because the British government paid more attention on development in the straits, settlements, and the federated Malay states. Consequently, the pondok schools were still a very important means of educating the younger generation in the unfederated states. In the year 1916 was indeed a significant year in the history of Malay education and sparked off a series of new posts of Chinese and Indian education as well. The British government had established the post of Assistant Director of Education for Malay schools that year. 3 years later, there was a Chief Inspector for English schools. In 1924, the position of Assistant Director of Education for Chinese schools was created, and finally, in 1930, there was an inspector for Tamil schools. It was enough for the government administration position were held by Malay princes and the sons of the elite Malays who studied in English schools. The British didn't want the Malay to receive higher education because the British wanted to make sure that the Malays are not exposed to the outside world and will obediently accept their place in society. While Malay vernacular schools only provided education in the primary level, teachers training courses were provided by the Malay College in Singapore, Malay College in Malacca, Malay College in Matang, Perak, Sultan Idris Training School in Tanjung Malim, Perak, and later in 1935, the Malay Women's Training College in Malacca.
Number of Malay schools in 1916. In street settlements, there are 191 number of schools, 12,934 enrollment, and 11,034 attendance. For the Federated Malay State, there are 365 number of schools, 80,034 enrollment, and 14,535 attendance. For the Unfederated Malay State, there are 137 number of schools, greater than 7,923 enrollment, and greater than 6,940 attendance, which means the total number of Malay schools in 1916 is 639, 38,891 enrollment, and 32,509 attendance. The street settlements include Penang, Malacca, Singapore. For the Federated Malay State include Selangor, Perak, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang. And for the Unfederated Malay State include Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu and Perlis. Despite the increased number of Malay vernacular schools in Peninsular Malaysia, the pondok school was still very important in the Unfederated Malay State. This is because the British government paid more attention on development in the street settlements and the Federated Malay State. Consequently, the pondok school was still very important means of in educating the younger generation in Unfederated Malay States. The British government had established the post of Assistant Director of Education for Malay schools in 1916. 3 years later, in the 1919, there was a Chief Inspector for the English schools. In 1924, the positions of Assistant Director of Education for Chinese schools was created. And finally, in 1930, there was an inspector for Tamil schools. While Malay vernacular schools only provided education in the primary levels, teachers training courses were provided by Teluk Blangah Teachers Training College, Singapore, 1878, Taiping Malay Teachers Training College, Perak, 1878, Matang Malay Teachers Training College, Perak, 1913, Malacca Malay Teachers Training College, Malacca, 1900, Sultan Idris Teachers Training College, Tanjung Malim, Perak, 1922, Raffles College, Singapore, 1928, and Malay Teachers Training College, Malacca, 1935.
In the hands of education for Chinese, The teachers and media were all imported from China, which means the educator and also the textbook that comprise all the elements of culture, history, and also geography were all written and printed in China. The medium of instruction was the Chinese dialect that of the clan that ran the school. Some of the school that using this instruction was the Cantonese school from Kampung Glam in Singapore, and also the Hokkien school at the Perkins Street. And then they also introduced Mandarin, which is Guoyi, as to enable the various groups with different dialect to communicate with each other. Revolution and politics. When China achieved victory in its Republican Revolution, it has brought a nationalistic literature among Chinese community in Malaya. British afraid of the increasing politicizations because they afraid that the politics in Chinese school might interrupt their administration in Malaya. So these are the things that the British have done as to ensure that the nationalistic literature do not spreading among those Chinese community in Malaya. So first, they intervene in the Chinese school as they can ensure they can control the politics in the Chinese school. And 10 years after that, they also removed the xenophobic elements in the Chinese texts. In 1935, they introduced teacher training programs, and also they have formalized the medium instruction was the Mandarin as the official instruction. The reason why they introduced teacher training program because they didn't want the educator from China to come here at Malaya because they're afraid that the teacher or the educator will spread all the nationalistic literature among those students in Malaya. So that's why they stopped importing teachers from China.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Siti Aisyah binti Syed Ali. Next, I'm going to present about the education for the Indians. In the early 19th century, the missionaries ran formal Indian education in Malaya. This, however, did not garner much response from the Indians and was therefore not successful. As coffee and rubber plantations began to sprout all over Malaya, the British government felt that it was the responsibility of the plantation owners to provide education for the Indian immigrants who came to work in Malaya. As such, the British passed the Labour Ordinance in 1923, which stipulated that plantation owners in the Federated Malay States were required to provide education for the children of labourers at their own expenses. It is because there were no guidelines or provision to enforce Indian education in Malaya at the time. The Tamil schools that existed were of poor quality. Most of the teachers were either not trained or equipped with very little things and comprised mainly Indian labourers recruiters, popularly known as Kangani, clerks, and other estate labourers. The medium of instruction in Indian schools were Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Punjabi, or Hindi. Like the Chinese schools, Indian schools also imported school texts and learning materials from India. Hence, children in Indian schools were taught about their motherland and subjects such as history, geography, and culture which pertain to India. This went on until the British government decided to intervene and appointed an official inspector of Tamil schools in 1937. A new training scheme for Tamil teachers was also introduced. However, all these efforts were carried out only in primary schools, and like the Malay schools, there were no provisions for secondary schools education.
English medium schools. English medium schools that existed were run by the missionaries and the British government. English schools were the only one that provided secondary education under the provisions of the colonial government. Students who ventured to such school could obtain technical and trade skills. Some of them even went to the extent of pursuing Cambridge Senior School certificate examination. The first English school was established by Reverend R.S. Hutching in Penang in 1816 and known as Penang Free School. Other English missionary schools soon followed during this era, and they were Malacca High School 1826, Singapore Free School 1834, and Victoria Institute 1893. However, in the early 20th century, this missionary school began experiencing financial difficulties and were eventually taken over by the British government.
Next, I'm going to continue about the English medium schools. English schools were definitely the least popular of all various type of schools that existed in Malaya in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially among the Malays. Most of these schools were established in the urban areas and out of reach of the rural folk in terms of distance and school fees. The Malay community felt that English education did not suit their religion and culture, and was also afraid that the younger generation would be influenced by the Christian missionaries. And at the same time, the British did not go all out to encourage the local people of Malaya to pursue higher education in English school. And those did go to such schools, however, comprised Malay princes and the sons of aristocratic families who would eventually be employed as government clerks and lower officials in a British administration. This was done with cunning on the part of the British to ensure that the sultans and aristocrats felt that they were part of the government administration.
In conclusion, the national education system has gone through many reviews from time to time to ensure that it will be in line with the progress and needs of our country. This is clearly stated in the national education philosophy to produce Malaysian citizens who are knowledgeable and competent of achieving a high level of personal well-being. Thank you.